I spent my life building an empire from a sewing machine and second-hand furniture, only to be told, in front of suited investors and crystal glasses, "Dolores, don't interrupt. You're not needed here." That was my daughter-in-law's voice. And my son. He just looked away. I never expected to be rich. I grew up folding laundry in a one-bedroom flat with 7 siblings and a father who used his voice more for shouting than singing. The first time I held money over $100, my hands shook so bad I thought I'd drop it. But I worked. Lord, did I work. I built a small upholstery shop out of my garage, one chair at a time. By 40, I was supplying furniture to boutique hotels across the state. By 60, I owned 5 warehouses and more real estate than I could count on 2 hands. They called me the matriarch of mahogany, though I never liked titles. I preferred mom. Or later, abuela. I married young, too young maybe, but I loved Frank. He wasn't business-minded, but he was loyal and kind. He passed when I was 58. Just when I thought we'd finally enjoy the fruits of our labor, cancer took him in 3 months. And suddenly, my empire felt very quiet. But I had my son, Matthew. My only child. And I poured everything into him after Frank died. My time, my energy, my belief. And yes, my money. I bought him and his wife Clarissa their first home as a wedding gift. Paid off the mortgage in one signature. When they wanted to start a business, I invested. I even gave them the deed to one of my retail properties. No strings attached. I remember when Clarissa first joined the family. Beautiful, polished, educated. She wore confidence like silk and had a tongue sharper than scissors. At first, I admired her. She had dreams, big ones. She wanted to turn our family business into a modern luxury brand. I listened. I funded. I supported. But slowly, something shifted. At Sunday dinners, my voice began to matter less. My suggestions were old-fashioned. Clarissa would interrupt and smile sweetly, saying, "Dolores, I think the market has moved on from grandma styles." She laughed, and Matthew, he just nodded. Like it didn't cost me a lifetime to build what they were now calling dated. Then came the board meetings. Yes, they made it a board. Suddenly, I wasn't chairing anything. I was asked to sit in if I liked. They moved the company bank accounts. Hired consultants I'd never heard of. They even changed the company's name from Dolores Interiors to Moira. You know what Moira stands for? Matthew and Clarissa. My name didn't even make the acronym. But I stayed quiet. For a while. I told myself this was what legacy looked like. That stepping aside was part of aging gracefully. Until the night of the investor dinner. It was a crisp November evening. We were hosting 12 high-profile investors in the ballroom of the Eaton Hotel. The kind with chandeliers like upside-down wedding cakes and waiters who pour your wine before you even look at your glass. I wore my best navy blue suit and the pearl brooch Frank gave me on our 25th anniversary. I sat at the far end of the table, watching Clarissa do what she did best. Charm, pitch, sell. Everything was going smoothly until one of the investors, a stern woman named Joyce with silver hair and sharper eyes, looked toward me and said, "Dolores, we'd love to hear your perspective. After all, you built the foundation of this business, didn't you?" For a second, I smiled. It felt like a crack of sunlight after years of fog. I opened my mouth to speak. And then, Clarissa placed a manicured hand on the table, tilted her head and said with a tight laugh, "Oh, Dolores is more of a figurehead these days. We handle all the real operations now. Modern strategies." Joyce blinked. But surely she still has a voice? Clarissa didn't hesitate. She leaned back and, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, said, "She means well. But sometimes she says things that just aren't helpful anymore." Then she looked straight at me and said the words I'll never forget. "Be useful, Dolores. Or at least be quiet." And my son, Matthew sat beside her, silent, staring at his phone. 12 investors. 2 waiters. One of them a man who once swept my factory floor as a teenager, and now owns a chain of hotels I supplied for years. They all looked at me. Not with respect. Not even pity. With dismissal. Like I was a ghost in pearls. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I placed my napkin gently on the table, stood up slowly, and smiled at Joyce. "Thank you," I said softly. "I think I've been useful enough for one lifetime." And I left. I walked 3 blocks in heels back to my apartment. The night was cold, but my blood was colder. I sat in my living room, surrounded by photos of a life they clearly wanted to forget. Me on scaffolds painting our first showroom. Frank holding a grand opening sign with baby Matthew in his arms. Me and Clarissa on her wedding day, laughing with red wine teeth. And I realized, they didn't just forget who built it. They erased me. The next morning, I called Gloria. My oldest friend. My war buddy. The woman who once helped me move 40 sofas in a single night to avoid a supplier breach. She answered in 3 rings and said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "They took everything, Gloria." And I let them. There was silence. Then her voice sharp as ever. "Then take it back." That was the day Dolores stopped being polite. That was the day I started building again. This time, not for them. For me. The day after that wretched dinner, the sun rose like it always does, but something in me had shifted. There's a kind of quiet rage that comes with betrayal. It doesn't scream, it doesn't throw things. It sharpens. It settles in your chest like steel. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the steam curling up from my chamomile tea. Clarissa's words kept looping in my head. "Be useful, Dolores. Or at least be quiet." That tone. That smile. That public humiliation. But what cut the deepest wasn't her. It was Matthew's silence. The boy I cradled through fevers. The boy I stayed up late for, sewing Halloween costumes by hand because he didn't want the store-bought ones. The boy who once said, "Mama, I'm gonna take care of you when you're old." And there he sat, letting someone else erase me. But not anymore. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. Not the one Matthew and Clarissa used, the one they recommended I retire with. No. I called Ruben Delgado, my old real estate lawyer. The one who helped me secure my first 5 properties before I could afford a secretary. "Dolores?" he said, surprised. "Yes, Ruben. I need to talk. In person. Today." By noon, I was sitting in his corner office on Hillcrest Boulevard, a place that smelled like mahogany and dusty contracts. He still wore the same rumpled suits and drank too much coffee. But when I told him everything, how I'd signed over the warehouse to Matthew as a gift, how I gave Clarissa proxy access to the business accounts temporarily, how I was now excluded from meetings, from decisions, his eyes grew dark with concern. "You trusted them," he said quietly. "And they used that trust to box you out." I nodded. He leaned forward. "Dolores, listen to me very carefully. If you're ready, we can unravel this. Not with shouting. With paper. With facts. But you'll need to be absolutely sure." "I'm sure," I said. "I've been quiet long enough." What followed was a whirlwind. I brought him every deed, every document I'd filed away over the years. Thankfully, I'd kept copies. I had titles in my name, account trails, gift letters, and even a few emails from Clarissa. Smug ones, loaded with just enough arrogance to reveal her real intentions. We started digging. And what we found didn't just sting. It lit a fire. They'd refinanced one of my buildings, using it as collateral for a risky expansion plan. They changed the branding and product line without filing the proper trademark transitions. Worst of all, they'd quietly funneled profits from the family company into a separate holding firm under Clarissa's name. Not Matthew's. Not ours. Hers. Technically, Reuben said, you're still the majority shareholder. They just assumed you'd never check. They were waiting for you to fade out. Fade out? I'd survived recessions, betrayal by suppliers, the death of my husband, and 2 cancers. I wasn't fading. I was sharpening. Over the next few weeks, I played the role of the oblivious grandmother. I sent birthday flowers. I commented on Clarissa's social media posts with emojis. I even brought Matthew tamales on a Tuesday like I used to. They had no idea. Meanwhile, Reuben helped me lock down assets, freeze questionable transfers, and draft a cease and desist letter that would make even a seasoned CEO sweat. But I wasn't just protecting money. I wanted answers. And for that, I needed more than a lawyer. I needed Eva. Eva Santiago was a retired forensic accountant and one of my old poker friends. I'd once watched her calculate a 20-year tax discrepancy in her head before the waitress brought the check. She wore thick glasses, walked with a limp, and didn't suffer fools. When I told her what was happening, she lit a cigarette, despite my protests, and said, "Give me access. I'll trace it all." Within 2 weeks, Eva had uncovered enough to make Clarissa's little empire look like a sandcastle built on borrowed time. Loans under shell companies. Diversion of funds. Personal expenses filed as business investments. A wellness retreat in the Bahamas? That was Clarissa's bachelorette party. Paid through the firm. I sat with Eva in my kitchen one rainy morning, flipping through the files she'd printed. "They didn't just sideline you, Dolores," she said, sipping her bitter coffee. "They robbed you. Quietly. Elegantly. But robbed, nonetheless." And that's when it truly sank in. They never loved me. Not really. They loved the comfort I provided. The open hand. The security net. And when they thought I was too old to understand or too weak to fight back, they cut the strings. But I still had one thing left. Control. And they didn't know it yet. One afternoon, I invited Matthew over. Alone. I told him I needed help assembling a new bookcase. He showed up in his designer jacket, eyes on his phone, barely looking at me as he said, "Where's the box?" We sat in the living room, surrounded by bolts and planks. I handed him a small envelope with my handwriting on the front. "Before we build," I said softly, "I want you to read this." He sighed, set down the screwdriver, and opened it. Inside were 3 pages. A list of all the properties still in my name. Copies of financial transfers traced back to Clarissa. And a letter, typed and signed, revoking all power of attorney and financial proxies. Effective immediately. He looked up. "What is this?" "My voice," I said. "On paper. You didn't hear me at dinner, so I wrote it down." "Mom," he said, uneasy, "this isn't necessary. Clarissa didn't mean anything by it." "Then why is she buying property under fake companies with my money?" He went pale. "Matthew, I gave you everything. Not just money, love, time, belief. But I won't be a silent investor in my own life. You want to keep your wife happy? That's your business. But if you think I'll let you two steal my legacy while smiling through dinners, you've forgotten who taught you everything you know." There was silence. Just the faint ticking of the old kitchen clock. Then he said, "Are you going to sue us?" I looked at him. Really looked. My little boy. Now a man who let someone else steer his soul. "No," I said quietly. "I'm going to reclaim what's mine. Gracefully. Legally. And if that ruins your marriage, maybe it wasn't built to last anyway." He left without finishing the bookcase. That night, I opened a bottle of wine and toasted myself in the mirror. To Dolores. 74 years old. Tired, maybe. But never finished. There's a strange stillness that comes after a confrontation. Not peace, no, peace is earned. It's more like standing in a room after a hurricane has blown through. The air feels heavy. The floor is wet. But you're still standing. And you're waiting to see what's left. After Matthew walked out that day, I sat in my living room for nearly an hour, staring at the half-built bookcase. One plank tilted like it was judging me. He hadn't called since. No text. No apology. No explanation. And Clarissa? She was even quieter. Which told me one thing loud and clear. They were scared. Scared enough to be cautious. Scared enough to stay away. But not scared enough to change. Not yet. A few days later, Ruben called me. They've hired their own legal team, he said. They're trying to challenge the proxy revocation, claiming you weren't of sound mind when you signed it. I let out a laugh so bitter I surprised myself. Dolores, he said. I'm fine, I replied. Just amused. That girl used to cry when her souffle collapsed, and now she thinks she can outwit me in court? But inside it did hurt. Clarissa was digging in. And she was dragging Matthew down with her. She didn't want my approval anymore. She wanted my throne. So I gave her what she feared most. Visibility. We drafted a press release. A short one. Nothing dramatic. Just a clear statement. Effective immediately, Dolores Mendoza resumes her role as chairwoman and sole decision-maker for Mendoza & Co. Interiors. All business dealings should be directed to her office. Unauthorized parties representing the company will be met with legal action. It was published in the business section of the local paper. Then picked up by a few design blogs. By the next day, I had 3 old clients calling me. One even cried, saying, I knew you weren't gone. The company's Instagram, run by Clarissa, went silent. And the next board meeting? I called it myself. Not in their sleek downtown office. In my old showroom. The one with creaky floors and the photo of Frank and me on the wall. They showed up late. Matthew looked tired. Hair unkempt. Collar wrinkled. Clarissa wore war paint. Sharp heels. Lips like red knives. Why are we here? She said, not bothering to sit. Because I still own 61% of this company, I said, folding my hands. And because you've made some decisions without authority. She smiled, fake and blinding. Dolores, with all due respect. I gave you respect, I interrupted. Years of it. I gave you property, funding, access, and my name. And you thanked me by silencing me at a table I paid for. Matthew shifted uncomfortably. I stood. My knees ached, but I stood. I built this business with my hands, Clarissa, when you were still in braces. Every dollar that funded your modern strategies came from couches I sewed, floors I swept, clients I charmed when I didn't even own a fax machine. I pulled out a manila envelope and slid it across the table. These are documents proving financial misuse, asset diversion, and intellectual property theft. All under your signature. Clarissa's hand twitched. She didn't open it. You can contest it, I said. But know this, I've already filed. The legal clock has started ticking. Matthew looked at the envelope, then at me. You'd really do this to your own son? My heart cracked. But I kept my voice calm. No. Matthew. I did this because I'm your mother. Because one day, you'll wake up and realize love isn't supposed to cost this much silence. And by then, I hope you've got something left to rebuild. Clarissa stood. We'll see you in court. I smiled. Oh honey, you've already seen me there. In the days that followed, Clarissa went on the offensive. She posted cryptic messages online about toxic elders and entitlement. She tried to rally some junior staff behind her. But here's the thing. I've been underestimated before. And the people who've known me, really known me, stood by my side. My old clients. My suppliers. Even a few staff members who remembered how I used to hand out tamales and handwritten Christmas cards every year. They came back. And slowly, Clarissa's influence began to crack. The final blow came from a name I hadn't heard in years. Gabriel Santos. Gabriel had started as a delivery driver for me back in the 90s. I taught him how to speak to high-end clients, how to invoice, how to recognize quality stitching. Now, he ran his own logistics firm, and Clarissa had tried to undercut his rates. He emailed me directly, "Dolores, if you're back, I'm back too. I've missed the way you run things." That email made me cry. Not because of the business gain, because I realized I still had people. I still had value. I wasn't invisible. I'd just been pushed into the shadows. But now I was walking back into the light. A week later, I was sitting in my garden, pruning my roses, when a voice startled me. "Mom." It was Matthew. I didn't look up. "Mom, can we talk?" I paused. The pruning shears trembled slightly in my hand. I took a breath and set them down. He sat beside me on the stone bench. For a moment, we said nothing. Just listened to the birds and the wind brushing the lemon tree leaves. "I didn't know," he finally said. "About the accounts. About what Clarissa was doing." I stayed silent. I thought you were okay with it all. I thought you were happy to let us take the reins." I turned to face him. "I gave you the reins. Not the horse. Not the cart. And not the nameplate." He flinched. "I loved her," he said softly. "Still do." "I believe that," I said. "But love doesn't mean silence, Matthew. Not when wrong is happening." He looked down. "She's leaving me." "I didn't say I told you so. I just waited." "I don't want the money," he said after a pause. "Not if it means losing you." That was the moment my chest cracked open. And for the first time in weeks, I let myself hope. That night, I sat at my desk and opened a fresh journal. I wrote, "Dolores Mendoza, age 74, CEO, matriarch, survivor, still blooming." Then I smiled and started planning a company-wide staff luncheon. Tamales included. There's a feeling you get when you clean out a room you haven't touched in years. Dust in the sunlight, memories in the corners, and the silence of things you thought you'd forgotten. That's how it felt walking back into the main floor of the factory I built with Frank. It had been redesigned. Glossy floors. Cold gray walls. LED strip lights instead of the warm glow of the old sconces. Everything was efficient, modern, and utterly soulless. Clarissa had turned it into a showroom for investors, not a home for craftsmen. I stood in the center, arms folded, and whispered, "Frank, we're taking this back." Matthew had asked me to let him handle things now that Clarissa had left. But I told him no. I wasn't going to fade out again. I'd spent too long in the shadows of my own creation. So I rolled up my sleeves. Literally. I called back Carmen, one of my oldest upholsterers. She used to bring her twins to the shop on Saturdays when childcare was too expensive. She had silver in her braids now, but her hands were still steady as steel. I hired back Sophia, who once left because Clarissa replaced her with aesthetic interns, who wore heels to work and didn't know the difference between satin and silk. Sophia cried when I called her. "Señora Dolores," she said, "I never thought I'd be here again." We scrubbed, patched, and rebuilt. Not just furniture. Pride. I reinstated the break room coffee fund. I brought back hand-stitched thank you cards for bulk orders. And when I walked through the workshop, people smiled again. Not because I was the boss, because I was Dolores. But change isn't always welcome. One afternoon, a notice appeared taped to the front door. "Cease business activity pending legal review." Clarissa had filed an emergency injunction, claiming I was tampering with assets under dispute. I held the paper with shaking hands. Sophia saw it. "She's still trying?" she said, fire in her voice. "Let her try," I whispered. That night, I called Eva. She picked up after one ring. "What now?" "She's trying to shut us down." There was a pause. Then the click of her keyboard. She filed under a shell company. One of the ones we already flagged. Can we counter it? Eva chuckled. Honey, we already did. The next day, I walked into the courthouse for the emergency hearing wearing the same navy blue suit I wore to the investor dinner. But this time, my back was straight. Clarissa showed up flanked by lawyers. Polished. Cold. She looked at me like I was a nuisance. An old chair left on the curb. I sat beside Reuben, and when the judge asked to hear both sides, Clarissa's team spoke of unauthorized access, conflict of interest, and unfounded emotional decisions. Reuben stood and said just one sentence. Your Honor, here are deeds, emails, and notarized statements proving that 74-year-old Dolores Mendoza is the sole legal owner of all named properties and assets in question. She is not trespassing. She is reclaiming. He laid the folder down. Clarissa looked at it like it was poison. The judge reviewed, nodded, and said, Ms. Clarissa Rivera, this court sees no reason to restrict Mrs. Mendoza's activities. In fact, any further attempts to do so may constitute harassment. Bang. Done. Outside the courthouse, Clarissa didn't speak to me. Just walked past, head held high, heels clicking like gunshots. But I didn't need words. I had one. That weekend, I hosted a dinner. Not for investors, but for the people who mattered. In my backyard, under fairy lights, with mismatched chairs and pots of homemade pozole, the people who helped build my empire returned. Frank's photo sat in a wooden frame at the head table. Matthew came too. Quiet. Still healing. But present. At one point, he pulled me aside and said, You really did it. You took it all back. I looked at him and smiled. No, Mijo. I just reminded them whose name is on the foundation. He nodded, and then finally asked, Do you think we can rebuild, you and me? That's when I cried. Because that meant more than any court win. Yes, I said. But you'll have to bring the hammer this time. In the weeks that followed, I began drafting something I'd never thought I would. A memoir. Not for fame. For record. I called it The Hands That Built It All. The first line? They tried to shame me in front of millionaires. But I remembered. I was the reason they had a table to sit at. The morning after the backyard dinner, I sat with my coffee and stared at the empty spot on the table where Frank used to sit. His chair was worn. One of the first I ever upholstered. Even after all these years, I never reupholstered it. I liked the memory woven into the fabric. The way he used to lean back and sigh, like the whole world lived in that breath. That day, the sunlight felt different. Maybe it was peace. Or maybe it was something rarer. Freedom. But even freedom has shadows. Clarissa wasn't done. Oh, she'd lost the injunction. But she hadn't let go of the business name. In fact, she started pushing a new company online under the original Moira branding. Same logo, same tagline, even the same photos of pieces I designed. I opened her website one evening and felt bile rise in my throat. The homepage read, Moira, where design meets modern legacy. Founded by visionary couple Clarissa and Matthew Rivera. No mention of me. No mention of Dolores Interiors, which they'd built everything on. It was like I had never existed. I called Reuben. Can she do this? He sighed. Technically, she's using branding from a previous company you gave her shares in, but she's walking a thin legal line. I slammed my hand down. I want it all shut down. We can file, he said. But it'll be a fight. I didn't blink. I've been fighting my whole life, I said. Let's go. We filed for intellectual property theft, branding misrepresentation, and defamation by omission. And I made one more move, something I had quietly prepared while rebuilding the factory. I launched a new brand. Not a rebrand. A rebirth. Mendoza and Company. Named after the woman who built it, and the people who built it with her. No more hiding behind abbreviations. No more erasure. Just truth. I brought in younger designers, yes, but I made sure they were the kind that respected history. They learned from Carmen, from Sophia, from me. And the first piece we launched? A replica of Frank's chair. We named it Legacy. It sold out in 2 days. Then, something I never expected happened. One afternoon, while organizing client letters in my office, Sophia peeked in. "There's someone here to see you." Clarissa. I stood. Instinctively. She walked in with her shoulders back and lips pursed, but there was something hollow behind her eyes. The war paint had cracked. "What do you want?" I asked calmly. She looked around. "You brought it all back." "I never lost it. You just covered it in dust." She swallowed. "I'm leaving the city." I didn't respond. I wanted to say that I regret how it ended. "No, Clarissa," I said. "You regret that I didn't stay quiet." Her eyes flickered. "You used me," I continued. "You smiled in my home, took my gifts, twisted my kindness into weakness, and then you tried to erase me." No, I interrupted. "This isn't a conversation. It's a conclusion." She lowered her gaze. "You'll win the lawsuit." "I already did." Clarissa turned to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, you taught me how to be ruthless." I smiled bitterly. "And I'm teaching others how not to be." She left without another word. I never saw her again. A month later, we hosted the relaunch gala for Mendoza and Company. It wasn't held in a hotel ballroom. It was held in my original showroom, restored, glowing with soft light, and filled with laughter. I wore a crimson shawl and pearls. Not because I needed to impress anyone, but because I felt like me again. Matthew came. He didn't bring a date. Just a bouquet of gardenias, Frank's favorite flower. He kissed my cheek and said, "I'm proud of you, Mom." I smiled. "You'll get there, Mijo. Just stop trying to impress people who want to forget who made them." He nodded. There was sadness in his eyes, but also something else, awareness. Later that night, I gave a small speech. I stood beneath the spotlight, cleared my throat, and said, "For years, I believed legacy was about giving. But legacy isn't just what you give, it's what you protect." I built this business with calloused hands and sleepless nights. And I almost let it go, because I thought love meant silence. But I learned something. If they love you, they'll never ask you to disappear. And if they do, you rise. And you reclaim. Applause filled the room. And for the first time in a long, long time, I felt whole. It's funny, the things you think will break you and the things that actually do. I thought Clarissa's public humiliation of me at the investor dinner was my breaking point. But it wasn't. The real breaking point came one quiet morning, weeks after the gala. I was watering the ferns in my front garden when a woman walked by, pushing a stroller. She paused at the gate and smiled. "You're Dolores, right?" she asked. "The one who owns Mendoza and Co.?" I nodded, unsure. "My husband and I bought one of your legacy chairs," she said. "It's the only thing our baby will nap in. I just wanted to say thank you." And she walked away, just like that. I stood there with tears stinging my eyes, hose still running, heart swollen. All those nights crying into my coffee. And now, my work had rocked a baby to sleep. It was the first time I truly believed that this, my work, my story, was bigger than Clarissa or Matthew or anything they could have stolen. It was mine. Back at the factory, the momentum was building. Orders were coming in faster than we could ship. Interviews were being requested. We had to turn down 2 magazine features just because we were too busy. Carmen's daughter, Lupita, had started helping with social media. She was 22, smart as a whip, and had a knack for turning every new product into a story. She came into my office one afternoon holding a tablet. "Abuela Dolores, look," she said. Yes, that's what she called me now. This post hit 150,000 views. It was a video of Sophia explaining how we chose the wood grain for our handmade dining tables, captioned, "Craft isn't dead. It's just been waiting for you to look closer." I watched it 3 times. There was no flash. No gimmick. Just the truth. And it spread like wildfire. We weren't just getting customers. We were getting believers. But Matthew, he was still struggling. He came to visit now and then. Quiet. Soft-spoken. Almost ashamed to breathe too loudly. I could tell he was unraveling parts of himself he'd knotted for years. One night, over dinner at my place, just the 2 of us, he set down his fork and said, "Mom, can I ask you something?" Of course. If I'd said something that night, at the dinner, would any of this have happened differently? I looked at him for a long moment. "No," I said softly. Because this was never just about one night. It was about what was allowed to grow over years. He looked down. "But," I added, "that night taught me to stop allowing." He nodded slowly. "I still love her." I sighed. "That's your burden to carry. Not mine." There was silence between us. Not awkward. Just honest. "Can I ever be part of the business again?" he asked, almost whispering. "You'll have to earn it," I said. "From the ground up. No title. No special treatment. Just like I did." He nodded. "Okay." And I believed him. The next morning, he showed up at the factory at 6:45 a.m. in jeans and work boots. "Where do I start?" he asked Carmen. She handed him a broom. And I didn't intervene. Because healing doesn't come from words. It comes from doing. Meanwhile, Clarissa had moved to another state. She tried launching a new luxury brand, but it never took off. Too many people had seen the court rulings. Too many former employees had shared their stories. The truth, it turns out, has a longer shelf life than curated branding. But I wasn't watching her anymore. I had things to build. At our 6-month relaunch anniversary, we held a small staff celebration. Pizza in the factory, papal picado strung across the beams, a mariachi trio playing in the corner. Someone brought cupcakes shaped like tiny chairs. One had La Jefa written in icing. I took a picture and framed it. Toward the end of the night, Lupita got everyone's attention. "We made something for you, Abuela." She handed me a photo book. On the cover, Mendoza & Co., the woman, the hands, the legacy. Inside were pictures, old and new, of the shop. Of Frank. Of every person who had ever walked through our doors and left a piece of themselves in the work. Pages of testimonials from clients. Even a page that said in Matthew's handwriting, "To my mother, the reason I ever had something to lose. And the reason I now have something to rebuild." I couldn't speak. I just held the book against my chest and closed my eyes. That night, I sat alone in my living room. Same room. Same chair. Same quiet. But I was not the same woman. I reached for my journal and wrote, "Blood may tie us, but legacy is who shows up when the hammer hits the nail." Then I smiled and turned off the light. One thing I've learned in 74 years is that silence has a cost. And for too long I paid it. I paid it in missed holidays, where I was told the guest list is tight. In the cold way Clarissa corrected me in meetings. In Matthew's quiet glances that said, "Please don't make this harder." I paid for peace with my own voice. But when I stopped paying, when I dared to speak, to fight, the world opened up again. I saw who stood with me. And who never really did. A few weeks after the anniversary party, I received an unexpected invitation. It was from a prestigious design conference in Chicago. They wanted me to be the keynote speaker. I stared at the email like it might disappear. Me? Dolores Mendoza? A Mexican grandmother from Santa Ana who built chairs by hand and wore orthopedic shoes? They called me a pioneer. A visionary. A living legacy. I laughed out loud. Not because it was untrue, but because I had waited 74 years to hear it from anyone but myself. I said yes. The day of the conference, I stood backstage in a tailored charcoal suit, my silver hair pulled back, my hands holding the note cards I didn't need. Matthew stood beside me, no longer in the shadows, but not in the spotlight either. He was just there. Supporting. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said. I nodded. It took me too long to be proud of myself. He lowered his head. "And I'm proud of you too," I added. "For showing up. That's more than most ever do." He looked up, eyes glassy. "I won't waste the second chance." "Good," I said. "Because I won't give a third." We both smiled. Then they called my name. I stepped onto that stage and looked out at hundreds of faces. Young, old, wealthy, starting out, dreaming, rebuilding. And I told them the truth. I didn't give them a speech about best practices or scaling revenue. I told them about betrayal, about erasure, about how the people closest to you will sometimes clip your wings while pretending to fix your feathers. I told them how I lost my seat at my own table, and how I built a new one. Stronger, higher, with room only for those who honored it. And when I ended, I said this: they shamed me in front of millionaires. But I remembered, I taught those millionaires how to sit. And now, I don't need their table. I have my own. The applause lasted almost a full minute. Some people cried. Some stood. But most importantly, I didn't. Not out of pride. Out of power. When I returned home, there was a letter waiting for me in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a short note written in looping, almost unfamiliar handwriting. "Dolores, you don't know me. I was raised to be quiet, obedient, grateful. But your story gave me permission to be loud, to leave, to build. Thank you for teaching me that legacy isn't something you hand down. It's something you defend. MG." I held the letter to my chest. Frank would have loved this. Back at the factory, orders had doubled again. We brought in more hands, more hearts. Common started training apprentices. Sophia launched her own line, Sophia by Mendoza, with my full blessing. Matthew was learning slowly. Sweeping, lifting, watching. One day, I found him teaching a new hire how to read grain patterns. "Look for the lines that dance," he said. I watched from afar and smiled. There he was, my boy. Not a CEO. A craftsman. We hosted a Mother's Day event at the factory for all our employees and their families. There were banners, tamales, and even a few bad karaoke attempts. Matthew gave a toast. It was short. Nervous. He said, "Most people inherit a house. I inherited a storm. And the woman who taught me how to sail through it." People clapped. I didn't cry. But later, when everyone was gone, I walked into the quiet factory, turned on the radio, and danced by myself in the moonlight. Just me, the wood, and the memory of Frank's humming while he sanded chair legs. That night I wrote in my journal, "They called me too old, too sentimental, in the way. But my fingerprints are in every stitch, every corner, every nail. I am not the past. I am the blueprint." The older you get, the more you realize. Life doesn't always give you closure. You have to build it yourself, brick by brick, with the same hands that were once told they weren't good enough, young enough, or quiet enough. And that's exactly what I did. It was late autumn when I finally walked back into the old archive room at the back of the factory. The one no one had touched since Clarissa modernized everything and called physical records clutter. Dust floated like ghosts through the sunbeams. I opened the creaky wooden file drawers, one by one, and pulled out the handwritten logs Frank and I kept in the early days. Receipts scribbled in pencil. Photos of our first showroom. A faded flyer from 1983, Dolores Interiors, custom with heart. I smiled. I used to pass those out at the farmer's market with Matthew toddling beside me, eating sticky tamarind from a paper bag. In that quiet space, surrounded by proof of the life I'd built, I finally felt, not just restored, crowned. I had made it. Not because of what I had regained, but because of what I refused to surrender. I decided to donate the original logbooks and materials to a local women's business archive. The day I delivered them, a young intern with big eyes and soft hands held one of the ledgers and whispered, "You wrote all of this?" I nodded. By hand. Yes, I smiled. Back before computers decided who gets seen. She looked at me like I was a relic. But I knew better. I wasn't a relic. I was a foundation. Mendoza and Company grew faster than we could have planned. But we did it right this time. I hired intentionally. Led with clarity. We became known not just for our quality, but for our integrity. We didn't chase trends. We built standards. A few clients asked if Matthew would eventually take over again. I always smiled and said, "He's learning the ropes." Because this time, nothing would be handed over with blind faith. Matthew didn't complain. He earned every inch he walked. He listened. He learned. And one day, about a year after Clarissa's exit, he asked if he could lead a workshop for young designers. I watched from the corner. He didn't speak with ego. He spoke with gratitude. He talked about failure. About learning too late. About loving something too much to let it rot in silence. That's when I knew he was ready. The next week, I called a staff meeting. Everyone circled around the break room. Mismatched chairs, of course. I brought in pan dulce and cafecito like I always did. I stood, cleared my throat and said, "It's time I step back." But not away. I'm not retiring. I'm transitioning. From matriarch to mentor. From boss to blueprint. And the person who will lead us forward has swept these floors, packed these boxes, and earned every ounce of my trust. Everyone turned to Matthew. He stood. Not cocky. Not surprised. Humbled. "Only if you believe in me," he said. And they clapped. Not because he was my son, but because he'd become his own man. That evening, he sat with me on the porch, just like he used to as a boy. "Do you forgive me?" he asked, looking out into the sunset. I took a long breath. Forgiveness isn't a ribbon, Mijo. It's a hammer and nails. You build it. Slowly. And you never stop working at it. He nodded. "I'll keep building," he whispered. And I believed him. In the final entry of my journal, I wrote, "They shamed me in front of millionaires. They tried to write me out of my own story. But I took the pen. I rewrote the chapters. And when they turned the page, I was still there. Not a footnote. The author. And now, I spend my mornings tending the garden Frank and I planted together. Roses and lemon trees and lavender by the fence. I walk through the factory once a week, greet every worker by name, and leave notes of encouragement tucked in lunchboxes. I mentor young women who remind me of myself. Hungry, underestimated, brilliant. And I sit in the same chair every night. The one I upholstered decades ago. The one they tried to take. The one I kept. And I whisper to it, "We're still standing."